First of all, just to mention, I'm running on my mic on these speakers here, so if don't give the stink eye to the talented gentleman at the desk if it doesn't sound right. Can you hear me at the back? Is it okay? Up? Okay, you can hear me at the back. Good. Okay. There's a reason for it, which I'll go into in a minute. And just to mention a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm one of the owners of this company, Outboard, that does this thing called TIMAX, which operates in the area of what we loosely term spatial reinforcement immersive audio. Unless you've been asleep or not listening in the recent past, you will no doubt have heard that everything has gone immersive, and particularly audio. I've seen a press release about a company that makes drapes like these, and they have an immersive drape on the market as well. So it's hard to escape it really at the moment. I've also seen a meme taken a scene from Pulp Fiction with a gun pointing at somebody going, okay, go and say it one more time, immersive, right, how dare you. So it's getting to be like that, some people. But it is a very real thing, and it's becoming commercially important for audio people to embrace this. Our activities fall into sort of three main market sectors. We use this TIMAX gizmo in the performance industry. That's our core market, so that ranges from opera through to musical theatre, through to, for example, EDM, fun, dance festivals. Slightly different application in all of those, but the performance sector normally is about localization, reality, authenticity, and there are reasons for doing that, which I'll just touch on in a minute. Immersive audio is the term we just tagged onto the bit we've always called, I don't know, surround, or the soundscaping, sound-filled, the synthetic creation of atmospheres and stuff for people, and that's used in experiential markets such as the theme park, museum, exhibit, planetarium, that kind of thing, and also in the presentation market, where it crosses over a bit both spatial reinforcement and immersive, for things like car launches, big auto shows, the faith industry, certainly in North America, is getting big for us. So we have a box which is over there, and I've got some software running here which will be a front end for that box, but it does DSP, playback, spatial audio rendering, and show control. And we have another system which we can plug into it, which does stage tracking, which is becoming also more popular now. There's a lot of systems that follow performers around the stage and make the lights follow them, or the video mapping or something. And we've been doing it for some years with the audio. Of course, it's an interesting sell because most people can understand a follow spot. I'm talking about non-audio people, but very few people understand why would you want to make the sound move. And actually, we're finding not making the sound move, but making it sound exactly like it's not actually really being reinforced. And so in the end, you also say to people, what do you think? And they go, well, I can't hear it. It's only when you turn it off that you can hear the difference. But I'm going to jump between the two of these things, but just a little word about the spatial reinforcement thing and the immersive audio thing. Part of the reason you need to look into how this is done and why we need to do it is because there are things that your brain-ear continuum does that can actually fool you, and certainly what we're trying to do is overcome some of that, because that can create stress and conflict in an audience's perception of a presentation or a performance. If their distant senses are in conflict, then that can be a problem. And in the immersive part of things, what our particular mantra is that adding movement to virtually any type of sound, other than ones where it's obviously going to have movement because it's a moving object, a dog or a vehicle or something, but even atmospheric soundscapes that you put in the background of such spot effects, if they move, they feel much more realistic and engaging, and that's because if you walk out the door into the real world, nothing actually stands still, so you're subconsciously used to hearing everything in this sort of continuously mobile state. So the two things do overlap a bit as well, but I'm going to show you examples of both of these, and we're going to go up to the bit that's going on now, because you probably know that in amongst the immersive audio offerings in the world, some of the major loudspeaker companies in the world are offering live sound opportunities to their customers, and now telling people that arenas you need multi-channel sound systems, which is all really good. And it's generating a conversation about something that is a crossover between the two of these. Taking playback material as well as real live performance material and actually panoramically spatializing it in a much more realistic way, as if it was actually a real life performance. And one of the erudite panel earlier touched upon
their production environment changing in terms of them having to produce multiple stems, separate stems for tours. It's not unusual for tours to be time-code linked. Roger Waters was, but going back to Kylie Minogue, her tours were all time-code linked. And of course, it's got to be because of all the synchronized media that is going on. But also, this means that if there's playback audio, we can actually do stuff to it rather than just cram it through more. It's probably a stereo sound system, or even in some cases, a mono, believe it or not, multi-channel. So this is an interesting area in live performance sector. In the UK theatre industry, this has always been a bit of a controversy. People have hated microphones. This is quite a good article about it in the Stage magazine in the UK. I wrote it, so I know it's quite a good article. It's actually a bit of it's actually advertorial plant as well, but the fact is that it addresses this problem, and I did actually research it as well, funnily enough, and I found some interesting things. Since I've been working in certainly the theatre, the live performance side of it, people have not liked microphones because the sound normally comes from some disembodied place up in the air, because that's the only way you could do it. That could make actors feel uncomfortable because there's a disconnect with the audience. They've got this room coming back at them out of time and that kind of thing. And it was shared either side of the footlights, directors and talent. The reality is, of course, sometimes you have to have it because there's a band, because it's a musical or it's a big open-air stage, so everybody's too quiet. There are children acting, they need to be amplified. And most interesting, I found, this is quite obvious when you think about it, that an actor who is actually quoted in this as saying, actually didn't make it up, I found it when I researched it. When I play to a large hall and I'm trying to do dramatic range, it's really difficult if I haven't got a mic to do the low range end of emotion without actually, because I've still got to project. But if I put a mic on, I can actually do the whole range of my, whatever it may be, method, technique, and actually still get the sound to everybody in the hall. So what's been happening over many years, that the system that we make has been taking those microphones and presenting them to the room in a different way to conventional mixing, and we're actually beginning to call this unmixing because it actually helps understand what we're doing. We're taking away the mix bus and we're taking all those mics, putting them into the sound system. But in this case of sound reinforcement like this, with independent time relationships to every speaker in the house. So what that means is that wherever you are on the stage, we can time the whole sound system differently to that section of the audience compared to that section of the audience. And you may wonder why we need to do that, but the reason is most people have heard of Haas effect or precedence effect, and if you don't manage that, the PA will actually manage it for you, and it will direct your attention to what you hear first rather than what you hear loudest. That's actually what the phenomenon is. Wherever you're sitting, if someone uses a pan pot to try and put the sound nearer to say where I am here, because you're sitting nearest to the speaker here, you're still localized to it because it's precedent. And this phenomenon in our brains is stronger than the level perception, and it's because we're designed to survive as a species. If you hear a twig crack in the forest over there, but you hear it bouncing off all of the walls and the stones and rocks and trees, you've got to know to split in the opposite direction. So we can't switch it off, and we all do it by the same amount. So what happens is that actually, if you go into a theatre and don't deal with this, you're going to just end up with an audience that is getting locked into the PA rather than the performance, and this does cause genuine stress. So that's what this was about, and it's almost worth a bit of a read. And I'll give you a little bit of a background. This is some of the shows that we do, West End and Broadway shows, large-scale musicals as well as dramas. We do also open-air operas. This is quite an interesting one because this is quite an interesting one as well. It's started to change on its own accord. I'll just put it up like this for the moment rather than have it change. I'm not going to use this very much. So this one here, I mentioned multiple time alignments to the sound system. This one here, all the sound system is buried inside the set because you're not allowed to see any PA. So there's lots of cross-firing, high Q, wide Q systems. And we have these multiple time alignments that I mentioned to you. Obviously, as people move around the stage, you have to change those time alignments because the imaging needs to change because they're on a different position on the stage. So in this case, not only were we having to do it for the actors moving around, but lumps of the stage set with PA in it were actually moving around as well. So actually your frames of reference were having to be taken into account when doing the show control. So quite an interesting challenge, but one that was met with aplomb by the TIMAX system. So I'll just go back to, it's going to go quickly into here and make sure that these don't change, which I should have done before. Forgive me. It's because I brought them in from somewhere else. Okay, so these are just a couple of examples of the things that we do. This is one that's quite interesting, which I'll show you this one now because we're going to come and have a listen to an example of this. This is a big festival stage in Germany, and this is a map of it in terms of speaker dispersion, and also up here you can see the actual where the orchestra's laid out on the stage. And what they did was they, using an object-based bit of soft auto rendering system in here, they replicated the actual acoustic panorama of the orchestra with just a relatively straightforward sound system. What was interesting about this is, as well as being able to do this with multiple different types of PA system, multiple channels of PA system, which are becoming prevalent, this was actually a way that it was able to be done with it dropped into a festival that was already in place, and they were able to actually make it, to some extent, and for some people in the room, by delaying the existing PA back to the relevant positions on the orchestra, make it actually spatialize. What I'm going to show you is, because this actually can create a concept of a frightening amount of numbers that you've got to crunch, but this is where this quantum leap in rendering tools has made this actually possible. But just jumping back to the everything moving thing, where was it? Here. It's just going to play you a little bit of what I would call an atmospheric track. Because we're in a film studio, let's do a bit of sound effects to wake everybody up. And there's a little sequence here of background effects and spot effects. And when I first start this moody synthetic soundtrack, it's just placed statically in a kind of arbitrary surround. These are all stereo or mono tracks, by the way, and they're just spatialized by, we've used the term guardedly, upmixing them into different speakers to sound a bit surroundy. So I'm going to play this atmosphere track, and then what you'll notice is that the brain's very good at this, or bad at it, depending on which you look at it. If you put something that's meant to be a real-life background sort of atmospheric track, your brain very quickly starts picking up its speaker that is nearest to you. You start realizing you're hearing it from a speaker rather than the space. If we take that whole thing and just float it around slowly the space, your brain lets go, and you find yourself just getting a bit more absorbed into it being actually a soundscape, a sound field thing, rather than actually a speaker system. So I'm just going to play that quickly, and then I will play it statically, and then I'll put it into movement as well. So it's static at the moment. And then I'll just start it moving, and I'm going to add a couple more layers of sound effects. So it's a bit of a jump there, sorry. So you start to let go of it a bit, because it's actually not coming the same thing coming out of the speaker all the time. And then if we add some more obvious things like this, sorry about that, but I thought it's time to wake everybody up a little bit. But the thing to realise is that, I mean, this is also very easy to do in this machine, and you can play audio back off computers very, very simply, but this movement thing is really quite important. It's obvious that the Harley and the chopper have to move, thunderclaps as well, but the number of theatre shows I hear where they play a thunderclap out of the PA, and it doesn't do that. Obviously, they move. It's one of the most amazing things about them when you hear them in real life, but they do need to move, and it just makes it a little bit more absorbing, and wouldn't claim that as an immaculate production, but it does give you the idea anyway of what's going on. So just going back to here again, why would we, jumping back to spatial reinforcement again, why would we want to localize stuff anyway? Get past this stuff here a minute. I'll come back to some of these. These are just examples of things that we've done it all for. So here you go. So I touched on this earlier on, that what's the point? Because, you know, you can have a left and right system. That's perfect, isn't it? You know, people have been telling us for a while. Center system appeared and then panpots to manage it some years ago for live performance anyway. And but the reality is that you're still going to, without some sort of low imaging management, you're still going to hear it all from the speaker that it's coming out of. And it's been shown that audiences do not actually react. They don't get absorbed in stuff as effectively if they're being distracted by the technology. There is an expression that is sort of resonates in the dramatic sort of sector, which is maintaining a willing suspension of disbelief. You may have heard of this before, actually, and it's basically about what a director wants to achieve when he puts a performance on. If I just mention in this context, at the moment, you can hear my mic coming out of, obviously, the sound system. If I just ask you, there's no right answer to this, by the way, or wrong answer, but if you just shut your eyes and point at the speaker that you think it's coming from, and I'll keep talking so you can do it, right? So what's interesting is if you look at the room, you normally find this divided opinion. It's sort of pointing at over here. If I was to do something like this, and I start talking now, do you hear there's a slight difference to that? I can't hear it from here very well, but do you notice that if you now shut your eyes, you all probably think it's coming from here? And this is if there was more of us on the stage and we were all walking around and you were trying to follow what was going on, it would be much easier if you could relate this to this. And that's part of this argument here, you know, and as well as various other things. It's about intelligibility and focus. In the excellent article in the Stage magazine, it talks about, you know, scenography describing a scene, lighting to set the scene, and sound to actually produce the mood in the scene. That's very often why sound is treated as part of a theatrical production. But the microphone bit of it is about focus. It's all about communication. And that's got to be right. That's got to be instant, because you get stressed out not being able to understand what's going on. So I mentioned this Haas effect thing, the precedence. What I'm playing with here is I'm eliminating the precedence. If I go back to here, it's in mono out of all these speakers. It may have changed tonally slightly because of me not being that good at matching it up. But if I do it to there, it's now basically more focused on me, because you're hearing me acoustically before you hear the speakers. So the whole point of doing this across multiple performers, and this applies just as well for people scraping things and hitting things as well as talking and singing, is it makes it much more realistic and authentic. There are some limits, cone filtering, if you don't delay it over delay it enough, and there's a thing called the echo perception threshold, which is what happens when the delay difference between my voice reaching you and the speaker reaching is too much, yet then you hear an echo. And we're designed to integrate the two arrivals together within about a 25 to 30 millisecond arrival from the point of view of voice, etc. So what this dictates is a different approach to actually the sound reinforcement. Those are the numbers I mentioned there. That's the measurements you do. You actually approach the sound system in a different way. We're all familiar with the idea of mixing to buses, and you know that'd be left, right, or 5.1, 7.1. You're basically mixing stuff together onto electronic buses, and then you're presenting them into the room either discreetly from those buses directly to loudspeakers, or you may have some system that matrixes them onto the loudspeakers as well. So when we do a sound system design that's going to do spatial reinforcement, we're mapping stage positions to audience positions via loudspeakers that are serving those audience positions. In the case of reinforcing acoustic sources like an orchestra or actors, we put a little bit of overdelay to make sure that there's the acoustic instrument or the acoustic voice is precedent. And then we basically have to manage that in real time as people move around, if they are moving around as actors. So that can either be a cued system like a lighting designer does, just go next, or it can be a tracking system, which allows you to actually follow people around the stage automatically. But essentially what you're doing is multiple time alignments and overdelays to all of the sources on the stage, and then you're controlling them variably as the action changes. This requires some transforms, otherwise your head would burst with all these numbers, right, involved. And so we invented some years ago what we consider the first ever object, which they're now called an image definition. This includes all of the information required to put on this microphone to all of these speakers so that you hear me from over here. And that's a sort of portable thing that can be dropped onto anybody's microphone or indeed anybody's surround effect stem and moved. Then the inputs can be moved around these objects to actually create movement. And these will always contain some, in the case of localization, level and delay, and that's what enables us to do the localization. And what I thought I would do is just show you a real life how this is actually done. This environment here is a rendering tool within the TIMAX software called Stage Space that actually makes it practical to do this in real life. If I just show you back to that one I showed you, this one here, there's a version of the Stage Space, lots of calculations, huge number of orchestral instruments on the stage. They were all parallel, they're put straight through the TIMAX matrix, straight out to the PA via these image definition objects. And they pushed the faders up and it sort of worked. You know, that's the interesting thing. So I'm just going to have a little show you of you here how this works, and then I'm going to play you a couple of things to demonstrate it. So this here is actually part of the stage space screen, and you might recognize the room that we're sitting in. And when I first came here, I took some measurements, and as it happens, it's 10 meters from this stack to that stack, and that gave me a reference for the whole room. So I put that on the map, and you can just see it at the top here. That line, that target distance I wrote in 10 meters on the other side, and that maps the whole screen now to the room. So this would be normally, most shows now have got a reasonably good quality CAD drawing of them, and we can import that in here, and ideally it's got all the speakers that hangs positions on the actual drawing. So you go to this screen here, and you basically drop them all onto the screen, and immediately you do that, it knows where they are because you've given it a dimension in the previous screen. And all the time, don't forget, what we're trying to do is find a way of computing masses of numbers that we're going to make the localization work, but without having to think about it too much. Each of these speaker types has some parameters associated with it inside. There's a dispersion characteristic, a little picture of it, because in most, this is a very simple system, but in most live performance environments or otherwise, there's a variety of different types of speakers, front fill types, main hangs, vocal system, surrounds, delays, balcony delays, etc. If you think of a simple theatre, there's different types, and they have to be defined with different dispersion characteristic and that kind of thing. And there's also another set of parameters in here called distance and angle compensation. And this is something that we've learned from experience being practitioners in this art of spatial reinforcement using something we call source-oriented reinforcement. That when you get this timed in really nice, what happens in the rehearsal is you walk around and find that you have to level shade various speakers in certain zones because of the inverse square law, resulting in that speaker, for example, feeding these people. You can anchor onto this zone much better than you can to a zone that's 10 meters upstage because that acoustic source is reaching you at a lower level. So that means I can get less level out of this and still have the localization work. So we've put in a dB per distance squared parameter, which is the second one down from the right, which you can adjust. You can manually go in and adjust this and instantly recalculate all of your numbers just for sections of a PA, and apply a different bit of your instinct that you've been applying subjectively, walking around and doing it manually. The other thing that applies is the angle of arrival. If you're sitting in this seat here listening to this speaker, or say this one here, listen to this one, when we try and localize you to a zone over here, your brain is actually, your head is this shape and your ears are here and you're facing that way. I'm doing this in reverse. And your ability to localize over there is impaired by the fact that you're not facing a speaker in a radial kind of situation. So we've actually got an angle, a dB per degrees parameter that we can put in there that the software can automatically compensate for how far you're away from the zone laterally, as well as actually, just longitudinally. And the interesting thing about this is that it adds to the instantaneous nature of this thing. You can change it and then just try something else very quickly. And people are looking at this and going, well, this now means I can use this in rep, which is the practice of putting 3 different shows a week in the same theatre, where the sound system might change, and we've never got any time. This takes away that reservation. And it also means you can use it on tour much easier, and you can use it in that festival situation that I showed you. You can drop into a gig and actually apply it. So in this particular venue here, I created localization zones. You remember these image definition objects? Each of these is one of each of these little blobs that you can see is one of them. And there's one that's sort of about here. And what it's saying, what inside it, it's saying those are the level and delay relationships to all the speakers to make the sound come from a space like here. But actually what's interesting is that we're now not putting any acoustic source there. We're just letting this build a virtual panorama based on essentially creating artificial, it's actually not here, by the way, it's actually behind. I've created an orchestra, big orchestra image behind the stage by putting in delays that will fool you into thinking that there's some acoustic sources behind there. This is not a million miles away from something called wave field synthesis that you may have heard of, some of you may have heard of, which is creating planar wave outcomes, but using generally a lot more speakers than this. Like the original ones were all butted up together. You'd walk into a room and there'd be 300 loudspeakers all side by side. Now there are now practitioners of it that are breaking them up and doing it in a more kind of lumped manner, but it is also, but it's a sort of, this is a very coarse-grained version of that, and because of this software, we can do it instantly, see how it sounds, and see if we like it. So if you just bear with, what I'd like to just play you an example of a little, actually orchestra that we've laid up on these images. It's a robot orchestra, as in it's totally MIDI files, which the keen-eared will notice, but it does show you the effect of what we're doing. There's also a stereo reverb placed sort of about out here, and what you might want to listen for is it feeling like there's something real there rather than actually coming out of the loudspeakers. And I've got a few other examples that we'll play, but we'll just play this one to start with. So I'll start it a bit down and then I'll turn it up. that's it. So if you don't mind the clockwork orange nature of the orchestra, did you get the feel of the thing had a bit of a spatial panorama to it that was not like it was coming out of the speakers? It is synthetic, and I make no apologies for the mix in the presence of such august company. But how can I help you? Yes. It's because I think it's because you're so close to it there. So yeah, there's a bit of reverb in there. Yeah. Oh, see, sorry. Yeah, is it coming out now? Okay. The voice. Oh, that's interesting. It was. The iPad's decided not to behave. So that should be coming from here now. Is that better? No? Let me have a look here. So we'll take it out of there then. So I've taken it out of there now, so it shouldn't be there. So we were just tickling them in there just to see what happens, you know. But it's true if you sit really near. Well, what now? You mean it's still there? Okay, yeah. Well, I've edited it, so that's fine. Yeah. But were you talking about the orchestral piece as well? Or? Okay. Okay. So, well, the iPad wasn't responding to the iPad, but never mind. We can look into that later. Thanks. So, this is just to give you an idea of the power of making that sort of calculation. Just to give you an idea, what was happening here was the inputs were being laid up onto this screen here, positioned as they would be in an orchestra. So as I showed you before, you could see the blobs on there, the input channels, which are all down the left-hand side here. They were all basically laid up there as to try and simulate where they might be in the orchestra. So if I basically take another look at this, another piece, try another piece of music, it will be interesting to see how you respond to that. What I'm going to do is turn down the sides a little bit, because they obviously are a bit prevalent if you're sat next to them. And I'll turn down the rears a bit as well for the same reason. They're only really contributing a bit to the reverb in this case. So this is just a different type of piece of music, really, and we'll see how this goes.
Too much, and whenever trouble appears, I'll wipe your tears, chase all your fears away. Nothing's ever bad as it seems, just of your dreams, right through the Milky Way. Made my mind up, I'm gonna get me signed up, 'cause I love you much too much.
Okay, just an example of another thing there. See if I can get this to go back to the right place. Part of the reason, by the way, is because my mic channel is being used as a playback track, so I leave it in the wrong place, and it's obviously going to come out of the wrong place. But so that's mono, and that's that one there. So different type of music. Hopefully you got the idea again, you know, that you're hearing something that doesn't sound like it's stereo or anything like that. You get a bit of a feel for the spatial distribution of it in the space, and it's arbitrary the way we placed it in the space. We could do it in a number of other ways, but there's obviously trying to lend it to the dimensions of the place that we're looking at, and you know, we're sitting in, and make it look and feel a bit realistic and authentic. Obviously, we could start adding spatial reverb. This has got actually a very simple stereo reverb track playing along with it, which is placed out wide on a couple of images, and that's where you're getting a little bit more space from that as well. So going back to the records, the examples of where this gets used, just as a matter of interest, we touched earlier on this is a simple one in Austria, where they've got a 3-channel system, and they're actually using exactly the same technique, but to localize to a real acoustic orchestra. And here it's a 1-cue show. The thing is just set up with those delay matrix objects placed around the orchestra, and it sounds unreinforced but louder for quite a large audience area, as you can see. The one I mentioned before in this situation, and the Rigoletto Opera, this is 7,000 people. This is 20,000 people. So it's kind of a real thing, and these are all very recent things. Going back to the immersive side of things, this is an interesting discussion to have and throw a bit of a cat amongst the pigeons about the difference between mixed formats and sound reinforcement solutions. 7.1, 5.1 originally, this is sort of almost extends all the way back to stereo. They're convenient mix formats and delivery formats, really. Obviously, in the case of 5.1, it originally had to be stuck on the edge of a bit of celluloid film. That got a bit more elaborate than that over the years, but you still have this issue where, highlighted by our friend over here in the seat here, is if we put a standard 7.1 mix discreetly into a system, people nearest to a given speaker will be very, very drawn to that speaker. And it is difficult to break that down if you're right next to a speaker, however much other sort of psychoacoustic matrixing you do. But in this situation, this is a kind of, you might call specialist cinema type affair, where the pre-show at this exhibit at Kennedy Space Center, you walked into a room and you were surrounded by 360 video screens with little gaps in them where they poked speakers through where they could find holes, and about 22 speakers and subs. And the guy mixed it on site on Pro Tools, and Pro Tools was going to remain there as the delivery, as the playback medium. And we went in and took the TIMAX and put it in between the Pro Tools and the speakers, so the 7.1 channels went straight into TIMAX, and TIMAX just fed them to all of the speakers, but with an anchor, for example, front right, that had a bit of the other speakers in it, but attenuated significantly as you got further away and delayed back to here, so you weren't so dependent on that speaker reaching you if you were over there to hear the content that was in that mix channel. And what's interesting about it is that because things like 7.1 and 5.1 sound phenomenal anyway, compared to just stereo or something, you don't immediately try and get people to go, well, that's amazing. But if you switch it on and off, you hear this a remarkable change in immersion. I use intimacy, and certainly it works for more people around the space, because what you're doing is you're applying a sound reinforcement solution to a mixed format that predominantly is designed for the sweet spot in the middle of the room. And of course, there are post-production tricks to minimize this in terms of diffusion and stuff like that. But in reality, managing delay times, arrival times of multiple sources in multi-channel sound systems applies equally to playback product content as well as to reinforcing acoustic sources. So this is a sort of example of where something like a TIMAX can get into a sort of film environment, but actually do something specialist because it's a specialist requirement. They wanted to emphasize the 360-ness of it because of the video being all the way around. There were a few spot effects were triggered by timecode off Pro Tools as well, little sound effects that were played off the TIMAX to go across the room. And then this is a different thing altogether, where a building was created for Milan Expo, and they had essentially 30-odd channels, little Maya speakers, some music, some noise of bees, who were actually in a beehive in England, but being fed the sound of them was being fed via the internet to this place, and there was their activity was being relayed to here and turned into MIDI commands that triggered different panning events in this exhibit. And this is now in London, in a horticultural gardens in London. But it was a very interesting kind of approach to making an immersive thing in an environment that is very, very uncontemporary. Different example, a soundscape in the National Gallery there as well, playback server, all that kind of thing. So these are all the kind of various things that we get sucked into from the immersive standpoint, both from the live performance and from the what would you call it, experiential market as well. And it's a very interesting time for this because, of course, the conversation is being stimulated both at the consumer end by the introduction of ambisonics into Facebook and YouTube, and the binaural stuff that's coming about as a result of that, and then also Atmos, which is much more resolved film sound system. The live performance industry is trying to catch up with a bit more finessing the immersive nature, be it enhanced spatialization in the frontal panorama, or of course adding for more synthetic effect the surround stuff. So what I thought I'd do is I'll just play you out with that one from that orchestra. Another little clip of it is shorter, and you can just have a listen to it, see if again, and then if there's any questions, we're going up to lunch then. So you're welcome to ask me questions afterwards. But I thought I'll just give you another blast of it, just for the hell of it, just so that you get another grip of it. So if I just go for. Questions?
Hi.
Thank you for listening.
When you're setting up a sound reinforcement system and considering TIMAX,
yes,
it doesn't need to be are you coming in with a certain design of sound system coverage in the sense of evenness of different positions of speakers for different areas of audience? Or are you applying, where normally you would have more of a monophonic coverage, are you applying the system to that? Like, what has to be done differently from the actual sound reinforcement vanilla type perspective before you can get an effective use of the TIMAX?
Well, there's a sort of good, better, best answer to that, and on the basis there's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's nothing magic about this. You have to, there are laws of physics and psychoacoustics to deal with. In the ideal world, if you had a stage with zones on it you want to reinforce, you treat the sound system as a multi-channel chunks of, each chunk of audience has its own bit of PA, and that allows you to condition what comes out of that bit of PA to make those audience members localized to those zone areas on stage. So what that tends to suggest is that if you have a cross-firing system covering everybody, it's contrary to that objective, that sort of technique. But the reality is that that's the best outcome. In between, there are modicums of improvement that you can make by applying what we just did there to more and more conventional sound systems. But you have to anticipate some potential pitfalls as a result of them not being ideally oriented the way that the purist sort of approach to this sort of design would dictate. And the reason is simply trying to use up that 25, 30 millisecond window of Haas effect to cover a lot of zones of stage, but for all the audience members. And if you point, for example, this system at everybody, and this system at everybody, it's difficult to set delays on this speaker that work for all these places on stage, for this guy over here and this lady over here, and not have echo perception threshold incursions or cone filtering threshold incursions. So ideally, if you can make it more of a discrete multi-channel sound system, it makes your job easier. You can do a certain amount with a conventional one, but I have heard the expression cone filtering hell used by an engineer in a theatre in Scandinavia, trying to manage it with people walking around. If you try and, it's when they move is the big problem, because you hear it sort of phasing, you know. I hope that comes close to answering your question.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm just thinking, inherently, there's a delay difference in coverage between someone who's sitting, 10 feet from a speaker and someone who's sitting 70 feet from a speaker. Maybe through the inverse square law, it's within a few dB in terms of the actual amplitude, but inherently there's going to be a difference in delay. And I'm wondering, my brain's like not wrapping around how you make that happen, how the magic happen with inherently a different delay between someone sitting 10 feet away from the speaker versus someone 70 feet away, even if the amplitude is relatively the same based on like a triangle hanging of a speaker or something like that.
If they're all in line with the speaker, which is the simplistic situation, then the acoustic source will be delayed as much as the amplified source, except by a little bit extra because it's a bit further behind, right? Because imagine this one starts here and this one starts here. They both travel at the same speed, so that as you get further away, the difference doesn't change between them. So that means that if you do delay this back to here, it will work for people here and people here. Where it becomes a problem is if you try and use, as I was cheekily trying to do just to show off, but it got caught, was having a bit of it coming out of the surrounds, which I've done on cruise ships before to get a vocal level up, just a little tiny tickle. You have them, what you have to do is make sure that they don't reach anybody where the delay doesn't work. Does that make sense? So in that case, the criminal thing to do is point speakers back at the stage, and if they're at the same level, you'll just hear an echo, and that's obviously not going to work. But if you turn them down and down and down, so they're just dealing with helping out the people right at the back who need a little bit of extra lift, presence lift, then you can then you just basically take a measurement to the speaker, take a measurement to the anchor source, the acoustic source, take the difference between the two, and add a bit of overdelay, and it works. But you do have to trim the level down, yes, so that you're overcoming the inverse square law issue. Does that help answer your question? I mean, I don't want you to be baffled. Hi.
I have a question. In a built-in venue,
Yeah.
Can you skip all the calculations and put a bunch of RTA mics in and have it talk to your system?
What, to make them automatically calibrate it from
Yeah.
microphones? Not at this point, no.
No.
No, that's actually the holy grail. It's a very valid question.
Yeah.
We would like to have a special kind of sizzling, whistling signal that we could put into the system and have it
Like
calculate.
sending pink noise into a room.
Yeah, and some kind of probably
Yeah.
multiple impulse response thing, you know, and it just hasn't, that holy grail hasn't been achieved yet, but we are sort of always cognizant of it, that how that would be a really good thing. So, because you don't always have the drawings.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't have the drawings, it would be nice, but
And each of the speakers, are they addressable individually in
Yes.
order to control them separately?
yes, every channel is a different.
Yeah. So is it changing the delay and the volume for each speaker?
Relative to a given input, yes.
Yeah, okay.
It's changing the mix to that speaker in terms of level and delay. The actual speaker level stays exactly, its own output level stays the same, yeah. And there's lots of that going on. One more here.
One more.
Then you can flee for lunch,
Jim.
which would be nice.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah, I found with using the Haas effect, where you've got the Haas effect gives you sort of the localization, and then the delayed speaker gives you the amplification, sort of. That my brain knows something's wrong.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of fatigue effect because it's not, I mean, the localization works,
Yeah.
but then there's something seems wrong. I don't know. Have you noticed that as on a perceptual level?
I think there's a bit of a connect between the way your mind works as an extremely qualified end user in terms of audio. So you're not the kind of standard consumer, and the way I look at it is if you have to strain to hear something out, then it's going to be fine for the shall we call them punters, right, for the sake of argument. But it definitely sounds different to just come out of the talent or the presenter. And our experience has been that the lay people involved, I mean the non-audio people, quite often are quite bewildered at how did you do that, especially on a large scale stage. We're used to hearing it coming from over there or over there, but it seemed to be coming from over there. And they weren't really troubled by the fact that there was something synthetic about that, because obviously there's a lot of compromises going on. People often say to me, which I haven't had this question today, which is quite good, but don't you get phasing coloration problems with all these delays and all these speakers? And the answer is, everybody does. If you put more than one speaker in a room, you've got a problem, and we just mitigate them by careful calibration and stuff, you know. So it is actually always a bit of a compromise, but it actually is better than not doing it. And we do it with very, very high-end opera. Purist sort of end users do not have a problem with it, you know. It's better if they can't see the speakers, because then they have a problem with it. But if they can't see them, they get on with it. But yeah, how many situations have you heard this done then, in immersive situations, of this kind of thing?
Well, I have to say, I demonstrated that in class.
Okay.
So there's not
Well, you know that if the overdelay isn't enough, you get comb filtering. So you'll get a tonality shift in the voice, and that sounds obviously artificial. It'll sort of go like this. And you have to get beyond 8 to 10 milliseconds of overdelay, because it's to get out of the musical kind of interference. If you go 1 millisecond, 500 hertz not, 2 millisecond, 250, 4 millisecond, 125, 8 millisecond, down at about 60, and you're now out of band for voices. But if you get beyond 8, 10 milliseconds, it starts to come back as a natural sounding voice, but localized. And if you then get to 25, 30, you hear the echo. So if you stay in that, I don't know if that's what you were hearing, but that can be something that you have to avoid, is that if it was tonality, it may well have been the comb filtering as a result of too short an overdelay, I think. So people are often a bit surprised that we put 10, 12 milliseconds on. It's to get out of that point. So I think I better wrap up because it's lunchtime. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks.
It was fantastic, as usual.